So the first step in our process is learning to identify arguments from other forms of language. Language can be used for lots of different purposes. It can be used to inspire us, it can be used to inform us, it can be used to threaten us or ask us a question. But what we're concerned with here is language that is attempting to persuade us by means of evidence. It's the relationship of evidence that makes an argument an argument. Now, a couple of things before we get right into the material. Note that the way that philosophers use the word argument is a little bit different than the way it's used in common language. When philosophers talk about arguments, they're not talking about heated, passionate exchanges when one person is angry at the other, although arguments can take that form. We're not talking about conflict. We're talking about an attempt to persuade by means of reason. Secondly, and this is going to be a theme that runs across all of the steps, as you learn to identify whether a certain form of language is an argument or not, be prepared not only to make that identification, to make that decision, to make that judgment, but also to back up that decision. In other words, you're going to not only have to come up with an answer, is this given piece of language an argument, but you're going to have to tell me or your instructor why you came to that decision, why you are judging that language in that particular way. Throughout these 10 steps, there will be some cases where there is a right and wrong answer, and then there'll be cases where there's not a right and wrong answer. And the tricky thing about critical thinking is you can't always tell which one you're dealing with. So the answer to that problem is to always back up your answer, always explain it. Okay, so how do we tell whether we're dealing with an argument? How do you tell whether a certain piece of language, no matter its length, is or is not an argument? Well, arguments are made up of two and only two components. One or more premise and a conclusion. Now, technically, there could be some arguments with more than one conclusion, but to keep things simple, let's just say that there's one conclusion for each argument. Now, both premises and conclusions must be assertions. They have to be claims. They cannot be questions. They cannot be sentence fragments. They have to be claims of fact. I'll get into the fact versus opinion matter more in a later step about acceptability. They have to be claims. They have to be, now, they need not be substantial. They need not be important. Any claim can function as either a premise or a conclusion. So I can say, for example, Post-its are the most important invention in human history. That's a claim. I can use that claim either as a premise or a conclusion. Post-its are the most important invention in human history. Therefore, we should have a monument in Washington to the inventor of Post-its. This is a reason to believe this. It can also function as a conclusion. Post-its are the most important invention in human history. A reason to believe that is without the Post-it, there wouldn't have been subsequent inventions in telecommunications, computer technology. I don't know if that's true, by the way. When I come up with examples, I may not come up with ones that are entirely true, but philosophers are rarely hindered by actual facts. Okay, how do we tell the difference between a premise and a conclusion? As I just said, any claim can function as either a premise or a conclusion. In order to determine whether it's a premise or conclusion, you have to look at the claim in context. You have to look at not only what the claim is saying, but what is it doing. A premise has one job. It gives evidence for the conclusion. And GEF is going to be an acronym that we're going to use a lot in these next steps. It articulates the primary relationship that characterizes an argument, that one claim gives evidence for another. The claim that gives evidence is the premise, and of course arguments can have many, many premises. The claim for which that premise gives evidence is the conclusion. Note that the functions of premise and conclusion are mutually defined. A premise is only a premise in the context of a conclusion. A conclusion is only a conclusion in the context of a premise. So, when you're given a specific example of language, you have to ask, is this an example of an argument? Is it an attempt to persuade me of the conclusion by means of another claim that functions as evidence. Now, the premise and the conclusion must be different assertions. They cannot be the same. They must be different claims. Also, the premise and the conclusion may not be flagged very clearly as such. Some people write in such a way that they'll say, and here's my reason for this, or I want to convince you of this. But not every argument is served up on a silver platter like that. Okay, so this is what defines an argument. What kinds of things aren't arguments? Mere statements of facts aren't arguments. So if I'm reading the instructions for my new digital computer, it's not an argument. Those are instructions. They're not trying to persuade me to do anything or to believe anything or to hold any claims. They're trying to teach me how to use the camera. So there's lots of different examples of arguments, of language that don't constitute arguments. But there's one particular function of language that is particularly difficult to distinguish from arguments. And that's explanations. Explanations often use very similar language to arguments. So if I'm trying to convince you that this is the hottest summer on record, I might say this is the hottest summer on record. I know this because the average temperature for the last week was 96.8, and no other week in July in North Carolina has ever posted that kind of temperature. That's an argument that's trying to convince you that this has been the hottest week on record. Now, an explanation may use very similar language like because or since, but have a very different purpose. So I might try to explain to you why we're having the hottest week on record. Well, we're having the hottest week on record because the smog won't lift, because there has been far less rain than usual. These are all explanations that account for a certain case. Now, the way to distinguish between arguments and explanations is not, emphatically not, to hang your hat on the presence or absence of any given words. A lot of people try to teach critical thinking by saying, if you see this word, you might be in the presence of an argument. You must not depend on the specific words chosen, okay? The reason for that is that we're looking at function. We're looking at what the claims are doing, not their content. Explanations give an account for why X is true or real, something like that, okay? It explains how something came to be. But when we're giving an explanation, we're not arguing that X happened, or that X is true, or that X is real. That's sort of a given. It's not controversial. When I say controversial, I don't mean important or substantial. I simply mean that the question is not a live one. For arguments, I'm trying to convince the reader that X is real, true, or something like that. Here's an example. We could argue whether Barack Obama was elected President of the United States. There may be some people who believe that he was not, in fact, elected President of the United States. That's not a terribly interesting argument because it's really already been established that Barack Obama was, in fact, elected to be President of the United States. Now, we can give a variety of explanations for how that came to be. Okay? Some people may argue that Barack Obama was elected because of the unpopularity of the preceding president's policies. Barack Obama was elected because he capitalized on the internet in a way no candidate ever had before. Barack Obama was elected because Tina Fey did this devastating impression of Sarah Palin, and that was that. Okay, all of those don't question whether Barack Obama was elected president. They assume that to be true. Now, we can argue about which explanation is better. But notice that the conclusion that we would be focusing on is whether the Tina Fey explanation is better or whether the explanation about the preceding president's policies is a better explanation for why this event occurred. So explanations account for how something came to be. Arguments try to convince you that something is or that something holds. Now, arguments can be on any topic, from the mundane to the sophisticated. We can argue about whether there is such a thing as international human rights. We can argue about, as the Supreme Court did recently, about whether persuading terrorist groups to resolve their conflicts peacefully is in fact an example of aiding and abetting the enemy. But we can also argue about whose turn it is to do the dishes. We can also argue about whether this top matches this skirt. For our purposes right now, the only thing that's important about arguments is the relationship of evidence. Okay, so for this step, the exercises are going to consist of small to medium examples of language. You're going to be asked to determine, is this piece of language an example of an argument? If not, why not? If so, why? Backing up your answers is at least as important as the answer that you get. Keep in mind that, like a lot of these steps, there may be exercises where reasonable people can disagree, and there may be ones where really there is a right or wrong answer. So go to the exercises and good luck. Okay, so let's talk about some more examples about types of language that either are or are not arguments. There's an entire genre of language that we can immediately say are not arguments, and that's things like commands or even vows or promises. When two people commit to a certain type of relationship in front of family and friends, we say that they exchange vows. They're not trying to convince us by means of reason of anything. They're not trying to convince each other. They're taking a certain kind of action. They're making a certain kind of promise. That's an example of language that doesn't constitute argument. Now, let's take the concept of an argument that, say, is an evaluation, a work performance evaluation, where a supervisor may say this person has reached this level of excellence in this type of skill set. That, as an evaluation, may well take the form of an argument because the evaluator may give pieces of evidence that demonstrate certain levels of competence or excellence. Other forms of argument may take the shape of political arguments. Candidates try to convince you that you should vote for them and give you reasons to vote for them. Now, it is also the case that in any political campaign, certainly in the United States, there's lots of means of persuasion used that don't constitute arguments in the form of providing evidence for a certain claim. So candidates know, for example, to wear certain colors of ties. And during debates, they know to hit certain types of emotional notes. As philosophers, we consider most of those techniques, virtually all of them, to be not appropriately considered persuasive. We would consider that only evidence-based claims about what the candidate believes to be true, about what the candidate says they will or will not accomplish in their time of evidence, to be the basis for forming an informed decision about a political candidate. Other forms. I talked a little bit about the difference between explanations and arguments. Let's take another example of something that's a difference between explanation and argument. Say you get into a car crash. You plow your nice new car into some nice tree. And someone might ask you for an explanation. How did this come to be? Were you tired? Were you distracted? All of those would be explanations. Was it the tree's fault somehow? Those would be explanations. How did this happen? Now, one is probably not going to need an argument or evidence that the car was crashed into a tree. However, the insurance company might say, I need evidence that your explanation is accurate. You're saying that you ran into this tree because a postal worker was walking across the road. That was your explanation. You had to swerve to avoid the postal worker, and so you chose the tree over the postal worker, which is a perfectly reasonable choice. And the insurance company might say, what's the evidence for that? In order to determine that your explanation is a reasonable one, then you might have to say, check the postal worker's route. You'll see that that's where that worker was at that moment. Be careful here. The explanation is for the car accident. The insurance company is not asking for an argument that provides evidence that the car accident happened. The insurance company is asking for evidence that your explanation is valid. That becomes the conclusion of the argument. So let's look at some specific pieces of language and determine whether they're an argument. You might see in some of your exercises something like this. And the question is this an argument or not? Well, we look at this, and first thing we notice is that we only have a single assertion. The cat got sick last night. A single assertion cannot an argument make because it cannot have a relationship with another idea. That would be the correct answer for this one. The cat got sick last night is not an argument because it does not provide evidence for any other claim. Now, what if we added another assertion to that argument, to that example of language? The cat got sick last night, you should clean it up. Now, this one's a bit trickier. One could argue that there are two different assertions here, and that one gives evidence for the other. The fact that the cat got sick is reason to believe that you should clean it up. Okay? Now, there may be a question about whether this is a good argument, but remember, for this step, we're not interested in whether an argument is good or bad, whether we should be persuaded of it or not. That's going to come in a little while. What we're interested in is, does this clump of claims constitute a relationship of evidence? I would argue that this example, one could probably say that yes, it is an argument. There is reason given, a premise, a claim, that is intended to provide evidence for another claim. Now let's try another one. And here we have a simple command. Clean that mess up. No other claim is given to convince us. In fact, this isn't exactly an assertion at all. It's not a statement. It's an order, it's an imperative, but it's not a statement. So the very absence of any assertion here means that this is not an argument. Okay? Let's do a couple more. A question. Where is that piece of paper? A question, by definition, again, isn't an assertion, is not a claim. And because it's both not an assertion and it's a single claim, this is not going to be able to function as an argument. How about this one? Crazy Heart, the movie, was overrated. The plot was weak and the acting anemic. Is this an argument or not? First ask the question, is someone trying to persuade me of something? Is someone trying to convince me of some particular assertion? And yes, this person is trying to convince me that a certain movie was overrated. Second question, does this person give me any evidence, any other claims that are supposed to lead me to that conclusion? And the answer here, again, yes. Two premises, actually. The plot was weak and the acting anemic. Okay? Both of these are claims. Both of them function in order to persuade me of this conclusion. Remember, arguments are not defined by their level of seriousness or by their level of import. They're only defined by whether we have one and only one relationship. Giving evidence for. That's what we're looking for. Is there a relationship by which one or more claims are intended to give evidence for another? If so, we've got an argument. If not, we don't. So now what you're going to do is practice on any form of language. You have exercises that give you some to work on, but keep in mind these are practical skills. You can practice them just as easily by opening up a newspaper or any book. Look at any specific example of language and ask yourself, does this constitute an argument? Are there one or more claims that are intended to provide evidence, give you reason to believe another claim? If so, the first are the premise, the second, latter are the conclusions, and you've got yourself an argument. So let's get down to some practice. So one question that a student has asked is, can an argument appear different according to the style, cultural conventions, or the way it's presented? Or in fact, can the definition of argument differ across different styles, cultures, and so on. And the quick and dirty answer to that is, according to at least Western philosophy, no, that all arguments have to have this relationship of evidence. Now, they may be framed very, very differently, and different kinds of evidence may be persuasive in one arena and not another. For example, think of a typical courtroom where we're dealing with a criminal case, where certain types of evidence is allowed, is considered important, certain evidence is not. Different courtrooms may have different kinds of evidence that they allow. But from the philosophical perspective, they're all arguments because they all involve the relationship of evidence, having one premise intended to convince you of another. So what you're looking for, and then to a certain extent, the philosophical skill is sort of abstracting from the particulars of style, from the context, to boil the claims down to their function and their relationship with each other. And in that sense, the definition that we're using here of argument is considered, at least by Western philosophers in the contemporary times, to be universal and to be cross-cultural. Can arguments be rated according to their strength? They can be. We are going to learn in steps 5, I believe, is where we start learning how to evaluate arguments. And there are, again, some standard questions we can ask of any argument, regardless of style or context, that can tell us whether we determine that argument to be persuasive. We're not there yet, though, in step 1. Okay, we're just learning to decide whether a certain example of language constitutes an argument at all. But yes, there are arguments that are better than others, and there are arguments that are weaker than others, and we can argue about whether arguments are strong or weak.